Hello YouTube! In this video we will compare 3 full-frame standard zoom lenses based on the f4 version of this zoom range category. The demand for f4s is admittedly quite a bit lower than its f2.8 counterpart because of that extra stop of light, but there are reasons why the f4 version has a special place in the market. If I'm not mistaken, these might be the only 3 full-frame 24 to 70mm ish range lenses with a constant f4, or close to it, on the current retail market that I was able to find, apart from various unique discontinued models that are still available on the used market. So why would anyone care about the f4s? They are cheaper, smaller, lighter, and more likely to have optical stabilization than the f2.8. This will be a shootout between Canon, Sony, and Nikon, all mounted on one camera. A Sony A7S full-frame mirrorless camera, with some adapters where needed. I'll explain a bit about these soon. The first up in the running of this shootout is the Canon glass from 2012 that comes with image stabilization. Before that, were only available some f2.8 versions without IS. Popular opinion says that this lens performs pretty good, and so already, predicting this lens to win the shootout would probably not be a stretch. Okay, at least for the optics, because I can already think of some details that the other lenses probably will do better at. Next up is a controversial lens from Sony, or should I say Zeiss. A lot of people have been underwhelmed by this particular 2013 model for at least 2 good reasons. Its image quality is apparently questionable in the corners, and it is supposedly expensive for what you get. But on the positive side, what you do get over the Canon and Nikon is E-mount compatibility, including autofocus, lighter in weight, and smaller in size. It's hard to discount conveniences like those, irrespective of the cost. I predict that the center image quality of this lens will be better than that of the Nikon lens, but equal to or lesser than the Canon, so let's find out if I am right. The last lens in this shootout is one of Nikon's kit lenses, so it is already lost. But really, I included this 2012 model for various reasons. Nikon doesn't actually make a 24 to 70mm constant f4, at least one that is still on the current retail market. But they do have 2 different variable aperture models, one of them being the one that we are reviewing, and this one. But that lens is more dissimilar to a constant f4 than our candidate is, plus it's an old model from 2000 anyway. Another reason to include this lens is that comparing it with higher-end models helps to quantify the results between a lesser and a greater. Understanding margins of quantity between multiple data points helps to refine a lens buyer's decision. However though, this lens does have the greatest zoom range in the shootout, so it's not a total loss for the Nikon. Speaking of which, imagine if this lens were to somehow turn out to rival the performance of the competitors. What an upset that would be, because this Nikon lens is vastly cheaper than the other 2. So here's hoping for a miracle. Before we begin the shootout, here's a quick overview of the main categories of the video. Note that this video has the benefit of videography in mind, and chapter selections are available in the video description below. Let's get started, shall we? We start off with lens mounting, something that might seem trivial, because it is, but you might be surprised to know how quirky some lenses are to mount. First I will mount the Comlite EF to FE mount adapter in order to mount the Canon lens, which goes on nice and smoothly. Now for the lens, and it too mounts effortlessly. Now to use the Nikon lens, I will mount the first of 2 adapters that I have, a generic no-name brand, and is it ever stiff to mount. The lens goes on too easily because there is too much slop on the connection. Look at it wobble. Can you hear that? Hardly a snug fit. So off it comes, and my goodness is that stiff to twist off. while the other side is excessively loose. So now goes on my photodiox adapter. It too is a tight fit onto the camera, but not as stiff as that generic one. Now the Nikon lens goes back on, and what an improvement! The fit is snug just like the Comlight. I am trying to wiggle it, but thankfully there is no slop. Okay, Sony time! And the fit is perfectly snug, so no issues there. Now we move on to the focus ring performance of each lens, starting with the Canon lens. It is fairly smooth, but certainly not the best I've felt before. The grip on the ring is moderately comfortable, as it is neither wide nor too narrow, and turns 80 degrees, which for video recording is reasonable but not exceptional. There is a small amount of slop in the ring though, so overall the Canon's focus ring turns out a mediocre performance. Next up is the Nikon lens. It does not turn smoothly, and the drag is way too heavy for controlled manual focusing. The ring is so thin that my thumb tends to drag along the casing of the lens, but at least there's no slop in it, and it turns 90 degrees for a fairly wide throw. Unfortunately, I neglected to demonstrate this, but it is quite noisy in video mode, and the audio sounds quite scratchy the faster you turn the ring. Overall, a poor performance. By the way, the Canon focus ring did produce some audio noise too, just not nearly as much as the Nikon. Finally up is the Sony focus ring, and it is super smooth, noticeably better than the Canon and especially the Nikon. However, it is just a bit light to the touch and could use just a little more drag for ease in and ease out sensitivity. It's close to perfect, but not quite there. Slow focus pulls are easy to manage, but quick pulls are tricky because of the fly-by-wire connection. I missed most of them, but did nail some of them. However, I think that most videographers will see this as a limitation. How come Sony doesn't make a menu feature to switch from electronic to mechanical focus? Photographers might not care about this, but I think that most would agree that for video recording, it is a real nuisance. You can see that I keep missing it here. Try again. Here we go. Nope, missed it again. Oh. There, I got one. Anyway, the focus ring turns silently 90 degrees for slow focus pulls and silently 30 degrees for fast pulls. Overall, a good performance. Pardon these screenshots for being out of focus, but first place goes to the Sony. Despite the fly-by-wire control, it was still a positive experience. Second place goes to the Canon, which has that mechanical focus connection that I like, but everything else about it was just okay. And third place goes to the Nikon. Interestingly, it was the only focus ring closer to the camera than the front of the lens. And this I prefer because that way it is easier to reach during recording. Other than that, I do think it has one of the worst focus rings I have ever experienced. Okay, next, now let's see how the zoom ring performs. The Canon has no slop in it, but it has no ease in or ease out touch either. The drag is just way too heavy. Here is a slow focus pull with one hand, but it is really jerky though, especially at the start. I am zooming as smoothly as I can, and I can assure you that the feeling of turning the ring is jerkier than the sight of the footage. Here is the same thing from the other angle going even slower, and jerkier, I guess, still using one hand. Oh man, someone is going to drop a comment on that. Now with two hands we can see that it is a bit smoother, but unfortunately not very practical. A zoom ring should only require one hand. Here they are side by side, and two-handed zooming is smoother, but overall this is a poor performance for the Canon zoom ring. The zoom ring on the Sony is noticeably smoother than the Canon, and the level of drag is really good. Here I am zooming somewhat slow, and it is fairly smooth. Here it is from the other angle. Here are the one- and two-handed samples side by side, and they look the same, which is good because one shouldn't have to depend on using both hands. And here is the Sony compared to the Canon, and the Sony is clearly smoother at zooming than the Canon. The quicker zoom throws with the Sony do produce some scratchy sounding noise, but then so did the others. I should have done a proper audio test indoors for this though. My apologies. It only occurred to me after the fact. The Nikon zoom ring is very similar to the Canon's, rough with too much drag. Here I am attempting a slow focus pull, but it's quite jerky. Here it is from the other angle, still using one hand. But yeah, no good, particularly from 24mm to 35mm. It's really sticky there. It is definitely smoother with both hands, for whatever that's worth. Pay no heed to the varied focal planes, it makes no difference to this test. Now we will take a quick look at the maximum zoom capabilities of these lenses. Here is the Canon at 70mm. The Sony at 70mm is just a bit tighter than the Canon, and the Nikon at 85mm is just a bit tighter than the Sony. I have to say that the difference between Sony's 70mm and 15mm more on the Nikon does not look like much of an advantage. Maybe I'm just imagining things. But this detail is for sure. The Canon doesn't quite get as much telephoto reach as the Sony at the same focal length. Third place goes to the Nikon because of that stickiness between 24 to 35mm. Otherwise the Canon was no better. They both equally sucked at video zooming. The Sony, however, stood out as noticeably smoother at slow zooming. And while it does not rival an actual power zoom, it may actually produce a passable result for video recording at events. Okay, now for the part you have been waiting for. It's time for the all-important image quality test. We will focus on each lens's 3 widest f-stops, where the green shading generally represents the greatest level of sharpness improvement from f4 to f5.6. Then f8 gets a little better, but then from f11 and beyond you will probably not notice anything. Note that throughout this image quality test the sun was descending behind me, lowering ambient lighting levels slowly, and for the Nikon lens's widest aperture I will always default on f3.5 instead of f4 in order to give priority to the widest aperture possible. We start off at 24mm with the aperture wide open to f4, focusing on the upper center of the middle pineapple. To my eyes, the Canon and Sony looked the same, so they tied for first place, and the Nikon was duller by just a bit. At f5.6, it was hard to tell the difference between the Canon and the Sony, even by pixel peeping, but the Canon was just a hair sharper. I couldn't tell the difference between the Canon and the Nikon, so they tied for first. At f8, the Canon tied with the Sony for first, and the Nikon was extremely close. So far I cannot believe that the Nikon did so well. That exceeded my expectations. So now let's up the game and go to the corner pineapple at f4. Oh, that's what I thought. The Nikon gives up here without even pixel peeping. A close second place goes to the Sony because the Canon is just a touch sharper. At f5.6, the scores are the same, with the Canon on top again. f8 is a surprise with the Sony being quite dull in third place. The Nikon is only slightly less dull than the Sony, and the Canon is much sharper than both of them. The Nikon showed the least consistency and therefore the greatest improvement. That was a sweep for the Canon, scoring first place on every 24mm test, achieving the maximum possible number of total center and corner points, 18. The Sony was almost identical to the Canon in the center, scoring only 1 point less, but didn't quite deliver as much in the corner, especially at f8. The Nikon looks fine in the center, but rendered very poor quality in the corner at f5.6 and especially f4. Overall, the Canon dominated the sharpness test at 24mm. Okay, now let's move on to the 35mm test at f4 in the center of the image. Basically, at 100% crop, they all look the same, but at 200%, the Canon is slightly sharper than the Sony, and the Nikon was very close to the Sony. At f5.6, believe it or not, the Nikon looked identical to the Canon. Impressive. The Sony was a bit duller than the others though. But f8 proved to be an even bigger surprise. The Sony finally edged out the Canon for second place, while the Nikon actually edged out the Sony for first place, putting the Canon in third. Wow, and you thought this was going to be a boring shootout. Now we make it tougher by looking at the corner where results tend to diverge more than the center. Unsurprisingly, at f4, the Nikon is in third place. But for the first time in the corner, the Sony beat the Canon, resolving more detail. At f5.6, the results were the same, with the Sony coming out on top again and the Canon in second. But at f8, the Canon improved quite a bit to take first place, and the Sony was only a little sharper than the Nikon. Here are the 35mm scores, with the overall winning performance scores being a tie between the Canon and the Sony at 14 points each. The Canon was one total center point higher than the Sony, and the Sony having one total corner point more than the Canon. Slight difference. Notice that the f8 center is so far the first time that the Canon scored only 1 point, or third place. The Nikon scored 11 points overall again. It is not bad in the center, but just fails in the corners. Moving on now to the 50mm test at f4 in the center of the image is another exciting surprise. For the first time at f4, the Nikon takes the lead for first place, resolving a surprising amount of detail on the center pineapple. But look how dark it is. The Canon was very close for second place. f5.6 yielded the same results again, with the Nikon just barely in first place again ahead of the Canon. f8 shows the Nikon to be on a roll, but being only sharper than the Sony by a hair. The Canon came in the dullest for third place. Unbelievable. Well, let's see if the corner pineapple test will turn the table, starting with f4, and look at how the Nikon crumbles in the corner while the Sony resolves a very high level of detail. The Canon was only slightly better than the Nikon. The results stayed the same at f5.6, even though the Nikon improved quite a bit and the Canon only somewhat. The Sony here is just so much sharper than the other two. At f8, the Sony won again, but this time not by as much, as this time the Canon trailed behind it, but the Nikon was still really quite a bit duller than the Canon. So now that the results are in, we can see that the Sony came out on top with 13 total center and corner points, but you can see that the Sony's strength came from its corner performance, not the center. In second place overall is the Nikon with an almost exact opposite strength than that of the Sony. It was impressively sharp in the center, but took a major dive in the corner. And then there is the Canon, whose overall score has been getting lower every test. To be honest, I'm not surprised because a number of reviews on the internet about the EF 24-70mm f4 have reported a significant sharpness drop at 50mm, or in the middle of the lens. My own testing can confirm that these reports are indeed true. One final word though, I would say that the Canon's one grand total point less than the Nikon's is offset in practical terms by the Canon's consistency. The Nikon's f4 corner image would be harder for me to live with than if all three f-stops of the Canon scored a mere third place. Remember that numbers are subjective. Moving on now to the 70mm test at f4 to the center pineapple, third place goes to the Sony, second place just barely goes to the Nikon, and the Canon is now back in the race in first place again, resolving noticeably the most detail. At f5.6 the results stayed the same for another Canon victory worth 3 more points, and at f8 no change occurred also. Lots of points for the Canon there. Off to the corner pineapple now, starting at none other than f4 again. Can the Canon conquer this too? Yes it does, another first place. And unsurprisingly, the Nikon just doesn't like to deliver in the corner. Third place. f5.6 proved to be the biggest surprise in the 70mm test. The Nikon improved massively in the corner for first place. Unbelievable! However, it wasn't a significant margin. The Sony was a very close second place and the Canon was a very close third. Indeed, the Canon's reign of terror comes to an end here. On we go to f8 now, where the Canon and the Sony tie for first place. It was a tough call here as the results were all very close. So now the 70mm results are in, and simply put, the Canon dominated. It really surprised me that the Nikon was sharper in the center than the Sony, because the Sony lens scored third place on every center pineapple test. This is unfortunate because it bears a Zeiss badge on it, and when recording at events, the 70mm focal length is a common usage, so it would be of some peace of mind knowing that its performance at 70mm was sharp, especially because this is an expensive lens for an f4 model. Now it is time to review the final results of the image quality test, and congratulations goes to the Canon with 59 grand total points out of a possible 72 points to win the sharpness test of the Shootout. This is what I predicted in the beginning, because many articles and reviews on the internet generally agreed that the Sony fell short of the Canon with respect to sharpness. The only individual merit of the Sony that surpassed the Canon's sharpness was at 50mm. Their overall scores tied at 35mm, but the Canon performed so much better at the extreme ends, 24mm and 70mm. Even the Nikon was sharper overall than the Sony at 70mm. Final comment before we move on. Remember that numbers are subjective, and I obtained these results by scrupulously comparing 12 megapixel images side by side in Photoshop at 200% cropping. If you edit these images, or any video footage, at 1920 by 1080, especially at no more than 100% crop, the unique differences of the images in this shootout would become so similar that most of the time you probably would not notice the differences with respect to sharpness. Now after all that, we finally move on to the optical stabilization test. All three of these lenses come equipped with optical stabilization, the Canon with its image stabilization, and the Sony with its optical steady shot. But I was very disappointed to discover that the Nikon's vibration reduction did not work with either of my FX to FE mount adapters. Therefore, only the Canon and the Sony will be compared in the shootout. Starting with the Canon lens, handheld, and no image stabilization. And now it is turned on. Here is the Sony lens with the OSS turned off. Now it is turned on. If we view them side by side at 100% crop, we can see that the Sony is noticeably jerkier than the Canon. Here they are at 200%, Certainly a win for the Canon. Both lenses were silent, not producing any humming, which is nice to know, but the Canon IS clearly stabilized the footage better than the Sony OSS. Moving along now to the distortion test, all images will be shown at f5.6. Please excuse a minor issue of the lines on the bottom part of the images for not being perfectly straight. When I pulled my grid chart out of storage, I discovered that it had deteriorated a bit. It makes little difference though. Just focus your eyes on the top and the sides of the chart and you will be fine. We will start off at 24mm in third place with the Nikon, as its barrel distortion is quite strong. Second place goes to the Canon, that is an improvement. But the Sony is almost distortion free, an impressive performance for a zoom lens. The Sony is off to an early lead with first place being worth 3 points. At 35mm the Nikon loses again, but this time it is slightly pincushioned. I almost thought that the Canon and the Sony lenses tied, but the Canon has a very slight barrel distortion, so I gave the win to the Sony. The Sony is on a strong lead now. At 50mm the pincushioning of the Nikon is tremendous, and I'm going to give the Canon and the Sony a tie for first place because they look the same to me. All the Sony needs now is one more victory for a perfect record. But would it be possible for the Nikon to at least get second place on the last distortion test? Let's take a look. There is what the Canon looks like with a bit of pincushioning. So no, the Nikon is worse. Another fail. And finally, even at 70mm, the Sony controls distortion levels like a boss. That was a perfect sweep for the Sony, with praiseworthy consistency. The Canon performed almost as well as the Sony in all but the 24mm test, where the distortion levels blemished the Canon's continuity. The Nikon was consistent too, consistently horrible. Now let's go to the Vignette test where light falls off in the corners, using the 3 widest f-stops. We start off at 24mm in third place, where the Nikon kit lens opens up to f3.5 and showed the strongest overall darkening in the corners. Stopping down to f5.6 slightly darkens the center while the corners get noticeably brighter, and f8 is only brighter by a hair in the corners. Second place overall goes to the Canon, whose vignetting at f4 is less pronounced than the Nikon. Stopping down to f5.6 improves the brightness in the corners and the center greatly, but improves only by a hair at f8. The Sony's fall off at the widest aperture is impressively well controlled for a zoom lens. At f5.6 the corner brightness improves and peaks in performance, because at f8 the corners and center actually get darker. The Sony leads the Vignette test at 24mm, so now we go to 35mm. Last place goes to the Nikon again, this time at f4. f5.6 lets in quite a bit more light, but overall it's still not that bright. At f8, it's barely brighter. The Canon's f4 is noticeably brighter than the Nikon's for first place. Stopped down to f5.6 brightens the corners and center quite a bit, but does not improve at f8. I felt that the Sony tied for first with the Canon. Apart from the fact that the Sony is a bit more telephoto, the falloff was about the same. Performance on the Sony only increased slightly when stopped down to f5.6, but no further. The Sony is in the lead by 1 point now. This time the Nikon just barely lost at f4.2, as second place was very close. f5.6 is only slightly brighter, and the same is true at f8. Here's the Canon at f4. Brightness levels noticeably improve at f5.6, and then again at f8, but only slightly. Here is the Sony's f4 in first place, looking quite bright in the corners. At f5.6, the Sony gets a bit brighter, and reaches maximum brightness there. And another boring win for the Sony at 50mm. We haven't seen any close dueling for some time now. We keep getting the same results here. Well, that's not bad for the Sony, especially if you paid for it. What are the odds that the Sony will not score first place in the next test just to keep it interesting? Well, as always, I examined the results from all of the contenders, and at 70mm and f4.5, the Nikon was awful. Too bad. Look at how much brighter it gets at f5.6 though. Such an improvement. With f8 being only a little brighter. Onto the Canon at f4 that gets much brighter all over at f5.6 for a nice improvement, but only improves at f8 by a hair. The Sony lens's ability to control light fall off at the widest aperture really is quite impressive. Stopping down to f5.6 only improves slightly, probably because its f4 didn't require much to improve upon. That was a perfect record for the Sony, scoring first in every test, just dominating the grid chart. One thing I will comment on though, is that a vignette test only looks at fall off in the corners. But the truth about the center of the image is that often at times the Canon was actually brighter. You might have noticed this during the sharpness test. Okay, next, it's time for the bokeh test, which will actually consist of 6 different parts. So we will start off with test number 1, the outside house windows test at 35mm only, wide open. First I'll start off with the Nikon image and zoom into this window at 100%. The Sony did produce some green fringing, but offered a slightly softer blur than the Nikon for second place, while first place goes to the ever so slightly softer and fringeless Canon, though indeed it was very difficult to distinguish its blur levels from the Sony. Here are all 3 side by side for comparison. That's an early lead for the Canon. This time we will zoom to 100% on these houses in the backdrop, but the results were the same again. The Nikon's bokeh looks the roughest still, but not by much. The Sony is a bit smoother, with color fringing still an issue, while the Canon is very slightly smoother than the Sony. I don't think that any of them look bad or good per se, more so just different. But if I had to choose one of them, I'd go with the Canon, leading overall now by 6 points. Now we move on to the daytime indoor bokeh test, for which 70mm only will be used, and for testing purposes I matched the Sony's white balance and exposure to the Canon. Can you guess which lens this is? It's the Sony. And here's the Canon, and as usual it is wider angle than the Sony, just as we saw earlier in the zoom ring performance test. In fit to frame view, the Canon appears to be softer than the Sony, but if we crop these 12 megapixel images into 100% on the building, then the Canon actually looks noisier than the Sony. Interesting. Here is the Nikon on the left, and it is rougher looking than the Canon. But here are all 3 side by side for comparison, where first place goes to the Sony. The Canon is still in the lead, but by 1 point. Now let's focus on the column in order to observe the donkey out of focus. Here are all 3 in fit to frame mode, and the Sony is the softest. But if we view the donkey at 70%, I thought that the Sony would be the least grainy, but actually they all look the same to me. That is another win for the Sony, and now it is tied with the Canon at 10 points overall. Now we move on to the first outdoor bokeh ball test at nighttime. Here are the Canon bokeh balls at a bright exposure. These are just for show, by the way. Now the Nikon. Now the Sony. Notice again how telephoto the Sony is? Here they are again, but at a dark exposure where they tend to look like onion rings and are easier to see, but these are the ones that are to be rated. The Sony's bokeh balls have some color fringing issues, rather like what we saw before, and the bokeh circle's outside edges are kind of wavy. I'm going to give it third place. The Nikon is fairly round, but look at that pointy edge on the bottoms. I still think that they look better than the Sony's though, plus there is no cold color fringing to deal with. The Canon is a bit lemon-shaped, and indeed very similar to the Nikon, but just slightly more preferable to me because of the Nikon's pointy edge. The viewer is welcome to disagree with me on this test. It is a subjective one. Thanks to the penultimate test, the Canon is now back in the lead with 13 points. Finally, we will look at videos of bokeh balls to offer a perspective with movement, but this time further away from the streetlights than in the previous test. Take notice of how the circles become more lemon-shaped as they move towards the edges, and that cars passing by do randomly affect the phasing of the bokeh circles to a minor extent. Once again, I liked the bokeh balls of the Canon the best. The colors are quite brilliant. The Nikon was again very similar, but the size of the circles were smaller, harder, and cooler, and so just a bit less appealing to me. I hate to say this, but the Sony was just ugly. Third place. This time, the viewer probably will agree with me. It's still subjective though. So there we have it. The Canon takes the victory in the bokeh test with 16 points. Even though color fringing is not directly relevant to bokeh performance, the Sony lens was the only one that had green color fringing problems. All things considered, all three lenses rendered decent bokeh, with one exception. I felt that the Sony's nighttime bokeh balls were quite unpleasant to look at. Next is the close-up test, to see how close each lens can focus to a subject. We start off in third place with the Sony, and then the Nikon gets a little bit closer for second place, but the Canon has a secret weapon. So are you ready to see it? Bam! No contest for the Canon, but that's because it has a 0.7 times magnification mode that has to be physically engaged. Otherwise, the factory specified 38 centimeter minimum focus distance applies. Now, before you get too excited about macro photography with this lens, just know that it has 3 important limitations. This lens is so close to the subject that most of the light gets blocked. External lighting will therefore be necessary, so I used 2 LED video lights on either side of the figurine. And finally, this is not a true 1:1 macro lens anyway. Now we will do a simple weight test. First I will weigh the Canon lens with both caps and the hood on, 664 grams. Now the front and rear caps come off. Now the hood comes off, the body only weighing 602 grams. Now the comm light adapter goes on, totaling 753 grams. Now the hood goes back on with the adapter still attached. Here's the Nikon lens with both caps and the hood on, weighing 517 grams. The lens and the hood with no caps weigh 486 grams. Now the hood comes off with the lens weighing 460 grams. When I attached the generic brand adapter, the weight goes up to 602 grams, but with the photodiox adapter attached, it reduces to 571 grams. Here is the Sony lens with both caps and the hood weighing 489 grams. Without the caps, but still with the hood, it weighs 460 grams. And the lens alone weighs 426 grams. In summary, if we just look at the weight of the lens by itself marked in green, then the lightest is the Sony by a little bit at 426 grams. But if you are mounting 2 of these lenses on a Sony A7 series camera, then realistically, the Canon and the Nikon have to use an adapter, so the size and the weight will go up quite a bit. These weights in green also include a lens hood. So in any case, the Sony will always be the lightest. the Nikon second heaviest, and the Canon is the heaviest. Now we will look at some Sunflares outside during the day at f8 without lens hoods. The Sony was the flariest, particularly with pronounced light rays. It was a tough call, but I'll give a tie to first place between the Nikon and the Canon, because the Nikon has some green and red lens flare effects in the foreground, but the Canon produces a strong blooming effect in the foreground. So neither stood out to me as better than the other. 2 more Sunflare tests to go. Moving on to f16 at a different angle using images this time, we start off with the Nikon that displays dense blooming around the sun and heavy bokeh circles in the foreground of the house. The Sony greatly minimizes both of those, but instead produces significant light rays. The Canon didn't reduce the blooming as well as the Sony, but better than the Nikon, and doesn't produce noisy iris blade circles in the foreground. Here are all 3 side by side for comparison. The Canon is in a strong lead now. So now let's check out some sunstars in fit to frame view. Viewed up closely, the Sony's Sunstar looks quite nice with those exaggerated God rays, if that's the effect you are going for. The Canon Sunstar is certainly quite good too, only that it blooms more than the Sony. And the Nikon is quite weak, but well diffused, if that's what one would prefer. Here are all 3 side by side for comparison. In summary, the Canon just barely wins by 1 point overall. Last up is the chromatic aberration test, those wavelengths of light that get refracted away from a common focal plane, causing green and purple color fringing. Believe it or not, the Nikon came out on top this time, controlling chroma levels quite well. The Canon was a very close second place, showing a bit more green in the corners, but unfortunately, the Sony exhibits major green color fringing in the out of focus areas and slight purple fringing on the text in focus. Third place. Let's look at it much closer this time to get a better look at the results, starting with the Nikon. I don't know if you can see much of a difference with the Canon in the center of the image like there is in the corner, but now we can better see the purple color fringing on the text in focus, as well as the green fringing in the out of focus areas. Unfortunately, the Sony completely bombed this test, as chromatic aberration levels are severe. In fact, do you remember back in the bokeh test that we saw green color fringing on the Sony just below the roof tiles and the bokeh balls just below the tiles? It's a bit faint in this view, but it is there. Or again, during the bokeh ball test at nighttime, we can clearly see the fringing on the Sony. But the open book with black text test is a good way to confirm chroma levels. To satisfy curiosity, let's slow down the f-stops on the Sony to see if improvements occur. It clears up a little bit at f5.6, then much of it is gone by f8, but I can still see green and purple in it. Finally, it is barely visible at f11. I'm afraid that some of you are going to boo me off the stage for this, but autofocus is excluded from this shootout, because only the Sony lens communicates with my A7S to achieve autofocus. The adapters that I used on the Canon and Nikon lenses do not transmit autofocus. Oh, how I wish they did though. So now after all the testing, it's time to draw some final conclusions about the Canon, Sony, and Nikon lenses. The best lens to mount was the Sony because it didn't require an adapter. Second place goes to the Canon because my Canon adapter was easier to mount than both of my Nikon adapters. The Sony had the best focus ring by far, even though it's a fly-by-wire. The Sony also had the best zoom ring. The Canon had the best image quality and the best optical stabilization. The Sony rocked both the distortion test and the vignette test. The Canon had the best bokeh, though not by much, but its minimum focus distance beat the pants off the Sony and the Nikon. The Sony is the lightest of the three in weight, so definitely nicer to carry around. The Canon has the best Sunflare control, and notice how the total points of the Canon and the Sony are 1 point apart? It's a close battle, but not for long, because the Nikon has the least amount of color fringing for its only first place ranking in the Shootout. But second place went to the Canon. Would you look at that? The Canon and the Sony both tied at a final total of 28 points each. Like I always say though, numbers are subjective. And this Shootout didn't even include autofocus. But in point of fact, speaking practically, the very fact that the Sony lens enables autofocus on the A7S while the others do not, would then put the Sony at a considerable advantage over the Canon, making the Sony the winner of the Shootout. So if I had to choose between the Canon and the Sony lens, which would it be and why? Well, there are 4 things about the Canon that really impressed me. I like the high level of image quality. It's not an easy choice for anybody to sacrifice on that. I also appreciated the sturdiness of the Canon lens's image stabilization, and Canon IS is among the best out there. And I do not like shaky footage. After seeing how bad the chromatic aberration levels were on the Sony, I think that I would rest assured knowing that my video files from the Canon lens would not be tainted so badly by color fringing. And finally, it is abundant on the used market for fairly low prices, so it's nice to not have to spend an arm and a leg to get a good lens. Plus, Canon lenses are the most on demand in the used lens market when it comes time to sell. However, the Sony doesn't make it easy for me to choose which one I would buy, because there are 5 things about it that I am quite impressed with. Its focus ring and zoom ring are so much better than the Canon, I couldn't believe the differences until I tried them for myself. I can get used to fly-by-wire. I don't feel that it's that big of a deal. And most of my manual focused video work is all pulled slowly anyways. The Sony displays a focus distance indicator on the camera that doesn't appear with the Canon and Nikon lenses. Also, and this is a big one for me, its vignette performance was really good for a zoom lens. Dark corners wide open really bother me. Also, the fact that it doesn't require an adapter, that is part of the reason why it is so light, is a big plus. And finally, it has autofocus. Need I say more? That is a very important feature to have in a zoom lens. And I did play around with it. It works just fine. Let's rephrase the question in this way. So if I had to pay $300 US more to get the Sony instead of the Canon, would I do it? With some hesitation, I honestly think that I would. Its OSS was disappointing and its chroma levels were bad, but the image quality at 100% is very close to what you would get on the Canon, and I don't normally crop video footage beyond 100% anyways, so I can live with it. All things considered, I do feel that the Sony does in fact have more benefits to offer than the Canon, justifying the higher price tag. I think that I can see now why many others have said that the Sony is overpriced for what you get. But to that, I would make the following rebuttal. What many people will do is look at a lens's image quality and ignore everything else. This is very shallow, because it is not true that the integrity of a lens is based solely upon one of its characteristics, to the exclusion of all the others. The Sony FE 24-70mm f4 OSS is indeed a quality lens. Congratulations if you made it this far. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. I have aspirations to make more of these shootout videos, but they are expensive and time-consuming. I do have a Patreon page if anyone would like to help me out with these endeavors. Otherwise, thanks for watching.